Hello, my name is Richard Stratton. I'm the author of the new book Smugglers Blues, and you're watching the Pavlina Show.
Hey everyone, it's Pavlina from the Pavlina Show, and I am here in New York City with Richard Stratton, who is an author. You have been, a drug smuggler in another life, which is just kind of cool. You're a speaker. You have just done everything, TV producer. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I like to say a marijuana smuggler because I want to make that distinction. I don't even think it's a drug anymore, is it? It's medicine.
Yeah. I know, but at the time you were doing it, like the hippie mafia, when you were doing it, it was more of like, not the mainstream, I guess.
That's true. We were trailblazers.
Yes.
It was people like us, the hippie mafia, that actually is responsible, I think, for the change in the laws in this country.
Yeah, I know. And actually, the last time I talked to you, you actually kind of knew that it was going to get legalized and everything, right? Like, weren't you telling me a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I was one of the original brain trust behind High Times magazine, which was the first magazine of its kind ever devoted to an illegal activity. But we knew then that ultimately the genie was out of the bottle, so to speak, and that ultimately the government, states and federal government would have to come to the realization that they couldn't control this plant. The plant has a life of its own, and you can't really stop it. It's doing its thing.
I know, that's crazy. And it's legalized in how many states now? It's a lot, right?
It's over 20, 23, and then now, it's legal for even recreational use. I heard California's going to go recreational too in the near future. So, there's so much money that's being made. Tax revenue is just unbelievable for these states, so they can't continue to ignore it. They got to do some. Money talks.
Yes, it definitely does. So you first bought your first 3 kilos when you were about my age, when you were in Mexico. Can you just kind of tell me about that story?
I had a roommate who was a little older and had a truck, and we used to take these trips on the weekends. Sometimes we'd go to Mexico, other times we'd go to different places in Arizona. And we went to Mexico one weekend. While we were on our way back, we stopped at this border town. And my friend disappeared with one of the people who worked at the hotel. And the bartender asked me if I was interested in buying. I asked him if I could buy some pot, and he said, well, let me get my son over here. So he brought his 9 or 10-year-old son over and said, take this guy and get him some marijuana. So the kid took me around the corner to a place where they fixed flat tires. And there was a guy there who became actually one of my regular contacts in Mexico, a guy named Jose, who said, well, I don't sell marijuana joints, I only sell kilos. So I was like, well, how much for a kilo? And he said, well, it's $100 a kilo. I had $300 on me, about 3 kilos, hid them in the door of the car behind the door panel. I borrowed a screwdriver and took the door panel off and stuck them in the door. And then we drove back across the border. I actually drove because my friend had been drinking too much and he was passed out. So I was very nervous, but it was a great kind of adrenaline rush. They just waved us through. They just asked us, well, how long you been in Mexico? Only a few days. Okay, go back, where you headed? Back to school. And that was it. So that became my addiction, was smuggling.
Yeah.
I loved it.
I know. Oh my gosh, that's crazy. Like that. And okay, so you were also caught. While eventually and everything after you had kind of built up and everything. Do you think you'd still be doing it if you were not caught, or?
Well, that's hard to say. It's changed so much since those days. Now, most of the marijuana that's consumed in this country is grown domestically. There is still a lot that comes in from Mexico and other places, but I probably would. Truth of the matter is, I was always a writer, even before I started smuggling pot. So when in high school and college, that's all I really wanted to do. So as much fun as it was, and as interesting and as intense, it didn't satisfy the creative urge that I have. It would satisfy it for a minute, and then I'd be wanting to do another one just to get that rush again. But with writing and working on TV shows and movies and stuff like that, it's a much different sense of accomplishment. It's a much more profound, deeply satisfying experience to be a creative person.
Yes, and we'll definitely get into your first book, Smugglers Blues, in a second. Now, you and my dad actually were in Lebanon at the same time. So during this time, my dad was actually in the Christian militia, which I recently found out, and I was like, whoa, okay, Dad, hardcore. So Lebanon was a very dangerous place. Tell me about your experience with being there and everything.
Well, when I first went to Lebanon, which was in the early 70s, it was absolutely gorgeous. And Beirut was one of the most beautiful cities you could ever imagine. They called it the Paris of the Middle East. Big, beautiful streets right on the Mediterranean, and just a gorgeous city with a lot to do. Always, it was where all the Arabs came from, like Saudi Arabia and Amorites and those places. They came to Beirut to party. And the Lebanese people have always been extremely hospitable. They love their food. So it was a great place in those days. However, the Civil War broke out in the early to mid 70s after I'd only been going there for about a year or two. But business went on, even in the midst of the war, which was extraordinary. I mean, you leave and come back and whole neighborhoods would be blown up and destroyed. And a lot of people left at that point and a lot of the Lebanese people migrated and left to get out of there. But I would go back and forth, and I spent a lot of time up in the Baalbek Bekaa Valley area, which is right up on the area where all the hashish is grown.
Okay, and actually, I remember at one of your NYU talks, you were talking about the dates in the hashish. So, can you just tell me that story? Because I know that was pretty interesting.
Well, what we would do is we would look for a product that they were having difficulty getting, a legal product they were having difficulty getting in this country. And then we would go wherever that was and get it and import it so that we could hide the hash in it. So in this period, it was like the early 80s, there was a war going on between Iran and Iraq, the first Gulf War. And you couldn't get these dates, these little brown dates that they used to chop up and put in cake mixes and stuff like that. They couldn't get them. So this company here in the United States, a big, huge food company, was trying to get those dates. And my friend said to me, if you can get those dates and ship them back to this country and hide the hash in there, we'll get the load in. It'll come in no problem, because we'll be using a real established company. We'll be using a bonded warehouse with a trucking company that is doing business on a regular basis. We'll pay for it with a letter of credit so it doesn't flag nothing to upset the computer. So that's what I did. I went to Baghdad, bought 2.5 million kilos, I think, of dates, and shipped them overland by truck to Beirut. We held them in a warehouse in Beirut. I bought the hashish up in the Bekaa Valley. Had the Syrian army actually transported from the Bekaa to the docks, to the warehouse down, and then we put all the hash. We hid the hash in and covered them up with dates. Put it back in the boxes. Put it on 7 containers, those big Sealand containers, and they put them on a freighter, a Greek freighter that landed over here in New Jersey. Wow. That's how it was 15,000 pounds of hash, 7.5 tons.
That is insane. That's a lot of hash. That's crazy. So, okay, now back to your first book, Smugglers Blues. So,
Third book, actually.
Third book. Oh my gosh.
Fourth book.
Fourth book. Just kidding. There's been 4. Well, this is the first one of the 3-part series.
Trilogy.
Yes, correct. Okay, so tell me about that book, and you can actually tell me about your other 4 books as well.
Well, Smugglers Blues tells the story, basically what we've just been talking about. From those days, in the early days in Arizona and Mexico, and gradually getting up into this, what we call the commercial smuggle, where we were doing these huge loads, bringing in from the docks, and all of the ups and downs, airplanes full of pot, just that whole madness of that era, which was a fascinating time. And, at that point, the United States was consuming something like 10 to 20 tons of marijuana a day. So you can imagine that guys like me were busy to try to satisfy this demand. The demand was there. As soon as the load would hit, it'd be gone in like 2 or 3 days. So it was an ongoing business. And then the book takes it from the early days all the way up to when I was arrested in Los Angeles. And it's about really the relationship between me and this DEA agent who came to know me and I came to know him, and we respected each other. It was, that book, the movie Catch Me If You Can? It's kind of like that. It's very similar. This guy and I it was like a cat and mouse game with him chasing me and just almost busting me, me getting out, becoming a fugitive, and then finally when they arrested me in Los Angeles in 1982, that was it. They didn't let me out anymore until 8 years later. So that's what Smugglers Blues tells that story. The second book, which is called Gulag America, is about the 8 years I spent in prison, the 2 trials that I had, one in Maine and another one here in New York City, my sentencing and all that, how I got myself out of prison. That's Gulag America. The third book, which has not been written yet, but I'm working on it now, is called In the World, and it's about getting out of prison, becoming a filmmaker, writing these books. I actually wrote one book. My first novel, Smack Artist, which I wrote while I was in prison, was published just when I got out of prison, 1990.
Gosh, that's amazing. Now, how has your second book been of the trilogy? Has that been published already, or like is it out?
No, it's the second book has been delivered. That's at the publishers. It'll be out a year from now. Smugglers Blues just came out, so we're going to wait a year and let it go to paperback and do its thing, and hopefully TV maybe or whatever we end up doing with it, and then Gulag will come out a year later, and then the third volume will come out a year from.
That is like such a fascinating trilogy. You know, it's just like really a story of like, you know, your life and like everything you experienced and everything. That's crazy. So now you of course have done a lot of producing, you know, on TV and everything. So just tell me about some of the things that you produced and like worked on after all of your adventures and everything.
Okay, well, I first started working on documentaries. I did a documentary for NBC about Mike Tyson that I wrote the treatment and I was a line producer. And then I started working with a fellow named Mark Levin. We did a bunch of documentaries for HBO. I had a magazine that I was doing then called Prison Life. It's all about prison life. And we made a deal with HBO where it was HBO and Prison Life Presents. We did Prisoners of the War on Drugs. We did Execution Machine, Texas Death Row. We did another one called Thug Life in D.C. that won an Emmy. And then the final one that we did was called Gladiator Days, about violence in the American prison system. While I was working on those, they hired me to work on the TV show Oz, which was a prison-based show that was on HBO. So I became a writer and technical consultant on the Oz show. Then I produced and was the creator of a show that I conceived of called Street Time, which is about parole, coming out of prison on parole, the relationship with the parole officer. It was a scripted series. It starred Terrence Howard, who's one of the stars of Empire now. He played one of the parole officers. Let's see, Scott Cohen, who's a brilliant actor, also played one of them. And who else was in it? Erica Alexander was in it. Rob Morrow played a character that was kind of based on my life, a guy getting out of prison after 7 or 8 years who had been a pot smuggler, who's trying to go straight, but his brother is still in the business, and his brother's trying to lure him back in. So that was Street Time. We did a movie called Slam that came out in 1998 that was a huge success. It won the Camera d'Or at Cannes, and it won the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance. Then we did another movie called White Boys, which I also wrote and produced, about these white kids from Iowa who want to be black gangster rappers.
Wow, that is a lot. That is you definitely have kept busy and everything. That's amazing. So what has been like your proudest moment, and what has been like your not so proud of a moment? You know, like what are like the two differences?
Well, my proudest moment is that when I was arrested, the government put a tremendous amount of pressure on me to become an informant. They actually said, we'll let you go if you'll help us set up this person, that person. One of the main people they wanted was a very famous writer, God bless him, Norman Mailer, who's gone now, but who was a very close friend of mine. The government was convinced that he was sort of like the hippie godfather of our hippie mafia family, and they wanted him desperately. They wanted to discredit him because he had been against the war in Vietnam. He was kind of an outspoken critic of the government, so they put a tremendous amount of pressure on me. Give us Mailer and you could walk out. Give us Hunter Thompson, who was a friend of mine. They wanted me to give them information about Hunter and a bunch of other people, lawyers that I knew. So I refused. Again and again I refused. And they kept offering me these deals and I kept refusing. And I said, look, I did the crime, I'll do the time. I'll take responsibility for my own actions. I'm not going to try to get out by ratting on somebody else. So that's my proudest thing that I ever did. I mean, I can live with that forever.
Yeah.
I don't have to look over my shoulder and think, I don't have to, explain to my kids, oh, I was a rat, I testified against other people. No, I kept my mouth shut and I did my time. So I'm proud of that. What I'm least proud of, or most sad about, is the people whose lives were destroyed one way or another because we were involved in criminal activity. Airplane crashes that happened, people who got killed in Mexico. It's a very dangerous business, because of the illegality.
Yeah.
So that I regret, and I feel sad about when I think about people whose lives were impacted adversely because of the business that I was in, that they got involved in. That's what I regret.
Yeah, no, definitely. But I don't know many people that wouldn't, like, they're offered, to walk free and everything, and like they don't take them up on that. Like, I don't know too many people that would do the actual time.
Well, the remarkable thing about the so-called hippie mafia is that a lot of the people who I was associated with did not testify and did not rat because they didn't consider what they were doing really to be something bad that they had to be ashamed of. So the people that I knew who were hippie mafia people were like, look, I did it, I'll do the crime, I'll do the time. So it was not that common for, unlike the mafia where a lot of them became rats. A lot of them testified. I mean, even Sammy the Bull Gravano, and the names go on and on. But with the hippie mafia, a lot of them stood up.
Did what they had to do and everything. Thank you so much for talking to me. This has been amazing. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.